Okay, welcome everybody. It's a privilege for me to be here and to welcome you all at the beginning of this day-long conference. Thanks to Tim in particular and to all the board of the British Student Young Pugwash for organising this annual event. And thanks also to the British Pugwash Group for supporting the event. For me, it's a great connection because some 16 years ago, I started out sitting where you are, looking this way as a British young student Pugwash. Now I'm working for the International Pugwash, and that might sound confusing already. It's a strange network, the way Pugwash is organized, if you like. We have this International Pugwash, which traditionally, since 1957, since it started, has been managing a whole range of activities, Track 2 dialogues, which is to say kind of science and policy dialogues between experts. And then various countries created their own national groups. So the British, throughout Europe, there are national groups in most countries. There are national groups all over the world through the Middle East and East Asia, Latin America. And everyone comes together more or less under the banner of International Pugwash when they do at these conferences. And for us in International Pugwash, it's quite an exciting time. We've just had a recent leadership transition. We had 22 years under an Italian physicist called Paul who's just finished at the end of last year. We now have a new Secretary General, which is the kind of CEO, if you like, of International Pugwash, who started in January. I'm the main staff member working for her. And as well as that, obviously, it's, let's say, a chaotic time in international politics. It's at times depressing, but it's also exciting. And I think it's an opportunity, especially for all of you. We need new energy, new ideas, and in particular, coming from the Pugwash line, we need more sober, rational analysis of events and input into policy making. So that's where I think Pugwash makes its difference and where it has traditionally made its difference, as I said, since 1957. Student Pugwash has been, I would say, an integral part of Pugwash since around 1979. They've been included in the main, young people have been invited to the main Pugwash conferences, Pugwash events, and over time, young Pugwash groups, such as a particularly vibrant one, the British Student Pugwash, have been active. And so our input into world politics is, I think, very useful. It's a different, more practical approach. There's a lot of scientists, and I'm really pleased to see a lot of scientists on the panels coming up today. And so I hope that you take this opportunity to, as Tim said, network amongst one another, network with us, chat to me and Richard and Tim and everyone else, and keep joining us at future events. So we have just one speaker for the moment this morning, I'm afraid. Here, Dave has a particular research focus on the intersection of technology and policy, which is very Pugwashy, if you like. But Dave himself is a policy fellow at BASIC, just having started earlier this year, following 8 years at the Nuclear Information Service, where he was director. So Dave is a particular expert on the UK programme, including research on the costs and mapping the technical problems within that programme. So Dave, a pleasure. I'll hand over to you now. And then once Dave's finished, we'll have Q&A.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. I'm really grateful to have been invited here today. It's really great to be here. And I'd like to reward your generosity and hospitality in inviting me by being slightly rude and offering a somewhat provocative response to the conference topic. But I hope you'll indulge me and let's see where we go with it. So, well, part of the topic at least. So those of you who know me, I think will be unsurprised to hear that I think that stepping back from the brink of nuclear war is a good thing, and I'm in favour of it. So let's get that out of the way. But I want to talk a bit more about fresh thinking on peace and disarmament. Do we really need fresh thinking on peace and disarmament? Again, obviously, a lot of you, I'm sure, coming here, full to the brim with fresh thinking, and that's great. I don't want to pour cold water on any of that at all. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say today. I always find these events really stimulating, fulfilling. Actually, as just mentioned, it's my immense privilege, it's my day job to be working at BASIC, and I manage BASIC, the Emerging Voices Network, which is a really great network of young people or people who are new to the nuclear policy field, and they're full of new ideas and perspectives, and it's a wonderful thing. You know, it really does sustain me, and I love it. One thing I've noticed amongst our members at the moment, and also other people, is there's a real strong need, I feel, for people to want to talk about the state of affairs that we're currently in, the state of the world. Like, there's a lot of anxiety about it. This was just mentioned, and I guess you can count me in the people who want to talk about it now, because I think that's what I'm mostly going to be talking about today. There's no getting around it that the strategic picture is very bleak, and the picture on arms control and disarmament is also very bleak. But I think it's very important to qualify that. It's not great. It's worse than it's been for a while. It is not as bad as it has ever been. We have a single proxy conflict at present. It's a horrible war. I think people are more upset about it being in Europe than they should be. It would be horrible wherever it was. It's probably winding down, for better or worse. And within that conflict, escalation has largely been managed, despite the fact that one of the belligerents is a nuclear armed state. There is an arms race waiting in the wings, but it's not upon us yet. You know, in terms of numbers, it hasn't actually got going between the US and Russia, at least. I mean, China's playing some sort of catch-up game, but it's not a race as yet. I would be surprised if after New START ends, that US and Russia holdings of nuclear weapons didn't rise to some extent. But the point I'm making here is that we're actually surrounded by off-ramps. There's loads of them everywhere you look. And the bleakness really comes from the fact that we're saddled with leaders who seem absolutely determined not to take any of them. But I don't think we can afford to let pessimism of the intellect about that and the situation we're in to crowd out everything else. We've been mulling this stuff over for quite some time, I think, probably in detail since the start of the Ukraine war, and I'm really glad to have an opportunity to talk about this today at the Pugwash conference, because one thought I keep returning to is the way that if you look back at the Cold War and the very worst bits, most threatening parts of the Cold War, you have these amazing initiatives, these incredible initiatives that have been launched in, a sort of really interesting mix of hope and desperation. So the Russell Einstein Manifesto, which, as I understand it, was the progenitor of international Pugwash. If you read it, it was written, I think, 2 years after the end of the Korean War. It was the same year the Warsaw Pact was formed. And in it, they talk explicitly about the abolition of war. I mean, there's just incredible audacity of it. It's amazing. I love it. When did you last hear anybody talk about the abolition of war in a serious context and people took them seriously for saying it? I mean, it's just amazing. So while I love to welcome and I love to celebrate fresh thinking on peace and disarmament and on every issue, but do forgive me, I think we also need to reach back for some of that old thinking, some of that energy and that hope. We were really blessed, the world was really blessed at that time with a generation of intellectuals who had known a world before nuclear weapons and were absolutely horrified at what had been ushered in. Well, some of them actually had been directly involved in ushering in. And they wanted something different and they wanted to change that. But aside from that cohort of individuals, you can see the same energy elsewhere in the Cold War. The détente process that I think indirectly led to the SALT treaties and New STARTs that we have now arose more or less directly from the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you can see in the early 1980s a period, I think, not unlike where we are now, where there was a rolling back of progress. You can see the Greenham women, you can see the nuclear freeze movement, these people who were, at that time, a lot of them treated as cranks, but I think modern scholarship, particularly within the nuclear freeze movement, has shown that that was quite influential in the later thawing of relations between Gorbachev and Reagan. So I think I just want to say, let's nurture that impetus, that power that those people had in those times in ourselves, and think about how to bring it to what we're currently doing. One of the most depressing things that I've seen in recent weeks, I won't mention the person by name, but a very august scholar in international relations, pouring scorn on social media on the idea of security guarantees for Russia, treating them as if they were sort of good behaviour reward rather than a really fundamental tool of de-escalation. So I want us to really remember some of the lessons of the Cold War. The fact that you make peace with your enemies. You often do it with gritted teeth. You hate doing it, and you do it because it's the least worst option. I think if we can remember things like that, we will get through where we are now. The other way I want to query the need for fresh thinking on peace and disarmament is, I think we need to be really clear about what is broken and what is not broken. And my take, for what it's worth, I mean, sorry guys, you're sitting here, you're going to have my take. I think a lot of the disarmament architecture doesn't need fixing. I think the goal of general and complete disarmament is correct. I think the idea of getting there through incremental steps, including confidence building measures, is correct. I think verification is a robust concept that needs to be retained. I think the ancient and occasionally noble art of diplomacy needs a bit of tinkering with, but it's broadly what we need to be doing. There are obviously some details within that do need fresh thinking, technical details of verification, questions of how to approach a war that's no longer really characterized by two large nuclear possessor states and then everyone else much further below. On that note, I think we really need to consider the extent to which the bilateral nature of arms control today made it more brittle than it could have been. And we need to think about how we change that in the future. But in my view, the fundamentals of arms control and disarmament are sound. I think we need to be clear about what went wrong and what has got us to where we are today. And I think we need to talk about and be reflexive about the failure and the role of our own institutions. I think there was a real failure to ensure that Russia made a transition to a stable democracy at the end of the Cold War. And I think there was a failure of Western institutions in that process. I'm not saying they were the only actors or solely responsible or even most responsible, but I think there was a priority at the time to ensure market access rather than a transition to democracy. And I think we're still living with that failure now. I think we need to make damn sure it never happens again. We should think really clearly about what would have George Marshall have done with an opportunity like that. I think we also need to think about our own domestic and Western institutions and their failure to address the slide towards right-wing authoritarianism, the failure to stop Donald Trump twice now, the failure to stop Boris Johnson, the failure to prosecute the perpetrators of the Iraq War, the failure right now to stop the genocide in Gaza. These things are not the whole picture in where we are today. They're not the only reason for what's happening in the world and the strategic issues that we face. But we really need to be clear-eyed about the failure of the institutions that we live with today to uphold an international rules-based order. And I don't think, and I absolutely would not say that we need to have institutional reform before we can have progress on disarmament. We can take steps now, and we must take steps now. But I do think we need to not resile from reforming our institutions and putting our own house in order when the opportunity comes. So, yes, please, new thinking. I think we need new thinkers, and we need new thinking to remind those of us who are inured to nuclear weapons how absurd and despicable they are. But we need to marry that with some of the old moral clarity and energy to get us through the current situation and to bring disarmament back to the table and to make it stick this time. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dave. That was an excellent, broad starting framework for us to think about this, the themes of this conference. I would welcome you to begin thinking of some questions. I would put the first note down and say, there are no stupid questions. So please don't feel as if you can't ask a question because it's too basic or too, please, ask what's on your minds, challenge Dave maybe if you want to. And ask about, where we're headed. Dave has given us a nice picture of where we've come from through the Cold War to now and what the problems have been. And we'd like to hear your thinking. So if you also want to make a reflection rather than a question, by all means. So are we going to do it with the microphone?
So I've got a roving mic, and also people online, hi again. If you want to raise your hand or post a question in the chat, you're very welcome.
Please.
Yeah, please introduce yourself as well. I'll pass you.
Oh, yeah.
If you're speaking to that now.
Okay, thank you very much, David. My name is Danny Reeder. I'm from the University of Liverpool. This is actually more of a question for you personally in terms of your work. And so you've given us a very great and broad overview of the challenges and some of the shame in which we should be facing. And so as a policy fellow, what are some of the concrete steps or initiatives or tasks that you think that you personally work on or that should be done?
Yeah, I did ask a really big, broad question, didn't I? That conversation, maybe I should have just talked about the UK programme and stuck to that. I think it's really tricky. I mean, it depends what domain you want to talk about in, obviously. I think it's very hard for those of us who are not sat in the White House or in the Kremlin to make steps and to talk about steps. I think if I was making policy suggestions now, I would probably be making them to France and the UK to put a bit of clear water between them and the other members of the P5 at the NPT review conference, and to show that they're actually serious about fulfilling some of their disarmament objectives. I would look to them to reach out to the TPNW states and to talk very seriously about how they would see disarmament happening and how they would participate in it when the time comes. I wouldn't suggest that they would necessarily be in a place to take steps now, but I think that's the kind of thing that I would like to see, you know, the kind of dynamic initiatives I'd like to see happening, because at the moment there's, you know, Des Brown, I think, is on record, the former British Defence Secretary, is on record of saying he thought he was creating a disarmament initiative with the P5 process within the NPT, and he created a cabal. Or no, oh, is it a cabal? No, cabal is a different thing, isn't it? The caucus. Yeah, sort of caucus. And so, yeah, it didn't really turn out how he intended it. But you've got these 5 states who have obligations and are not delivering them, who are getting together every year and coming up with very miserable excuses for why they're not doing it. You know, I think the only thing they've produced is a glossary, which is, it's nice, but it's not disarmament, is it? So something like that shows willing, I think, would be helpful. In terms of actual steps towards disarmament, I think some sort of just and safe and sustainable end to the Ukraine war is the first thing that needs to happen for any other progress. And, you know, we need progress on disarmament, we need progress on climate change. We cannot afford to have powerful states in the world at loggerheads right now.
I think if I might just add, if it's okay to abuse my position as chair.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're at an interesting moment, I think, and in particular in the European context. So Pugwash has been organising several workshops in the past year on the future of European security, in particular, obviously, with the Ukraine war happening. But the Ukraine war is, I don't want to downplay its significance in any way. But the arms control architecture that has kind of restrained, if you like, Russia and the US in particular for many decades has been crumbling. And it's not just in the last 3 years. It's been crumbling for more than 20 years, with all of the different treaties being gently eroded or abandoned. And we faced a situation, as Dave said, where there's only this New START treaty due to expire in February 2026, after which there are no restraints on any of the nuclear weapon states, save the NPT, which, as you've said, is a little bit limp at the moment. So there's immense pressure on the NPT and on the non-nuclear weapon states to achieve something there. But I mean, the nuclear weapon states have the responsibility, obviously, within the NPT. But yes, I think the UK is in a particular privileged place, maybe, I would say, in reimagining what the future of European security will look like and how it wants to integrate in working with the Russians, because that's inevitably, whatever comes out of the resolution of the Ukraine war, European states and America, to an extent, are going to have to work with Russia. Russia is right on the border, of course. I mean, you all know this, but there's going to have to be some kind of rethinking about what constitutes security, particularly around that border space and particularly around Ukraine. And that impacts the new Nordic states who have joined NATO. There's a huge kind of strategic space up there that people aren't necessarily thinking about, this huge border with Finland and Russia. And the Russian strategic forces are just over that border, not too far from Finland. So there's all of these kinds of little policy steps that, for example, the US could be thinking about as it works with what's called the DCA agreements that they have with other NATO states, where they might be basing nuclear weapons in Finland, which then directly threaten the Russians. Is that a good idea? What other kind of assets are they going to try and put in the high north that will inevitably be seen as a threat by the Russians? Is there a need to do these things? And those are the kinds of conversations I think that certainly at the NATO level they should be having amongst themselves. And I think the UK has and France have a particular role there. So, okay. Do we have, we have two questions at the back. We have one here as well. Why don't we take the two questions together at the back? You're right.
Hello, Derek Crane. I'm a researcher at Ridgeway Information in London. This week, Donald Tusk indicated that Poland was thinking about nuclear weapons in a way it hadn't openly said previously. There's also increasing uptick in discussions in South Korea. I think the US has designated South Korea an area of concern in terms of its interest in nuclear weapons. How are these developments and other countries potentially showing interest in developing nuclear weapons going to affect disarmament and arms control initiatives? And how, in terms of institutional failure, which you mentioned, do the institutions currently set up to monitor these things, the IAA and the NPT system in particular, are they prepared for potential proliferation amongst newcomer states?
Hi, thanks so much for speaking with us. My name's Kyle Tucker, and I'm an MA student at King's. I really liked your idea about looking to the past and looking to like the beginnings of the movement for inspiration about how to move forward. I feel like what I've noticed is that, you know, as World War II goes further and further into the past, we really lose like the historical memory. You know, there are very few hibakusha left, for example. And I kind of worry just on a societal level and also in general in the nuclear community that, you know, there's always going to be those documents to go back and look to and read to and get inspiration from. But when there are very few voices left, it's going to be really difficult to maintain that spirit toward disarmament. And I was just wondering what you might think about this idea of historical memory being really important. It's like, again, like you said, proposing to abolish war, you know, that's only something that could have happened with people who experienced the trauma of World War II of being taken seriously. And now it's kind of seen as a joke. You know, what do you think about, is there a way to preserve that historical memory without another Great War?
Thanks very much. I think we should probably both respond to these questions. So I am going to get really bored. It's just me talking.
Yeah, I'll add something.
To the first question, it's obviously very worrying, these noises about states that are currently members of the NPT in good standing thinking about acquiring nuclear weapons. I think in the case of Poland, there are probably things that can be done within Europe and European security guarantees, possibly out with NATO, possibly alongside or sort of sub-agreements of NATO, I think can address their situation. I feel the way forward for South Korea is a bit less clear. I think it's worth bearing in mind that nuclear weapons are rubbish, like they're really bad. That I don't mean like necessarily their effects, but they don't actually create a good security situation for possessor states or for anyone else. Their records in terms of actually deterring kinetic war below a certain threshold is very bad. Their record in terms of engendering insecurity from other states perceiving you as a threat and responding to it is really bad. So I think for a lot of states in the NPT, they don't want nuclear weapons. They can see that having nuclear weapons is not the solution to their problems. And I think what's needed is to provide other solutions. And that's needs to be done through diplomatic means. And as I say, we're very unfortunate to be living through a time when we've got absolute idiots running the US and Russia who aren't very interested in these things. But that time will pass, and we will need to fall back. We'll need to have all of these tools ready for when there's an opportunity to deploy them. And I just hope that we can minimize the number of states that decide to go over that threshold and acquire nuclear weapons. I think if some do, it will be a smaller number perhaps than immediately seems to be the case. That would be my take on it. On the question of historical memory, I think that's a really interesting one. And, I think about it as well. I went to see some Rebecca Scher speak a year or two ago, and I encouraged quite a few people to come because the opportunities to actually see them speak will be, more and more limited as sadly as they die off. One of the gentlemen who spoke there, I think, was a baby or possibly in the womb at the time of the bombs going off. I would say, though, that I don't think the picture's entirely bleak. Obviously, there's a certain immediacy of listening to and interacting with people who are direct witnesses to things. But we have so many ways of preserving them and their memories that we didn't in the past. We at one stage we just had the written medium at a long distant point before then. We didn't even have that. So there's a lot of ways of preserving them. And I do think we can keep memories alive. I don't think there's anyone, a substantial number of people who want to bring back slavery. I think the historical memory of how horrible and unnecessary that was is being successfully retained, and there's no forgetting about that, not in a big way.
Thanks. I might just add on the first question, because I'm not sure of the level of many of you students. So some interesting reading, picking up on what Dave said, is into the examples of where nuclear armed states go to war. Kinetic war. India and Pakistan, almost immediately after nuclearizing openly in 1998, fought a number of wars, essentially serious conflicts, exchange of fire over the border, troops dying, and it's happened repeatedly. So nuclear weapons don't eliminate war. So, in what sense do they provide security? That's an important question, which isn't being asked. Maybe Poland are not thinking in that way. Maybe South Korea are not really thinking in that way. And even the debate in Japan now is quite frightening, which is that there are politicians openly calling for acquiring nuclear weapons despite their specific history. I mean, it feels a very strange moment. And this is very dangerous. So harking back, I think, then to the second question, you mentioned the Russell-Einstein Manifesto earlier. This was launched in 1955. Bertrand Russell, eminent British mathematician and philosopher, Albert Einstein, no introduction needed, and this incredible and quite short manifesto calling for scientists to congregate and discuss the threat of thermonuclear weapons. It's a really important document, and it did then launch the Pugwash conferences, which took place 2 years later, the first one. Do we have people of that caliber in society today who can make those calls? Why are they not doing so? Why is Elon Musk not more interested in this? That's one person. You can imagine the answer. But this year will mark the 70th anniversary of the Russell Einstein Manifesto, and Pugwash, British Pugwash, will be hosting an event in July on the anniversary, or just before the anniversary.
Day after, I think.
Day after, sorry. And we're thinking through what other steps can be taken. You know, how can we renew this call? How can we reinvigorate the language that was used? How can we make people more aware? Because it's something that's, as you said, the abolition of war at that point, being called for by Einstein and Russell, was not seen as something outlandish. But if you do it now, who is of a sufficient stature that they can do that and be taken seriously? I think it's a really important thing that we can think about and discuss and plan. Okay, we had one more question right here, and then Matteo at the back. So just on the
Do you
front.
want to go with Ishan and then Matteo?
Exactly.
Good morning, Ishan Yasuja. I'm doing a master's here in international political economy. And conveniently, my question is on India because I'm from there. I wanted to ask, how do you think countries like India, which possess nuclear weapons but are not permanent members of the UN Security Council or the Non-Proliferation Treaty, how do you think we can participate in disarmament discourses and essentially shape the way that disarmament is executed in the global political economy?
Hello, Matteo from Queen's University Belfast and SYP UK. My question is start from our reflection from the past and from what you mentioned about the Cold War, where there were two big blocs basically opposing to each other, and for how big and escalating was the situation. It was somehow easier because like the protagonists were only two. And in that time, Pugwash did something really amazing. That was to manage to open a channel of dialogue between two big blocs that oppose to each other. And so my question is, given the current situation, which is we don't have anymore two big actors. We have many actors with claiming that we will have nuclear weapons. Now many more people, many more states have nuclear weapons, and also given the current historical period we live in, where there's a tendency towards much more regional, nationalistic policies. What do you think are the protagonists, the actors, the non-state actors that can create dialogues similarly to what Pugwash did during Cold War? Do you think it's civil society? Do you think it's academia? What do you think about this? Thank you.
Did we have one more question? Did I see a hand before?
Let's get straight.
Over these two?
I'm happy to get a third if there's someone waiting.
Yes.
Yeah, that one.
Over here. I'll come to you in a second.
Thanks. I'm Joe Langham from University of York. We're just talking about raising awareness and dialogue and non-state actors, academic groups. I just wanted to get your take on the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and the famous doomsday clock, and whether you think that's helpful, very unhelpful, or broadly no impact at all on the kind of disarmament debate.
Sorry.
You said, but you mean specifically the clock?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So just making a note so I don't forget anything. How can states like India shape disarmament and participate in disarmament? I think that's very tricky because obviously the major international instrument is the NPT, which has no space for nuclear armed states that aren't one of the P5. And I think it's quite tricky to imagine nuclear armed states other than the P5 being incorporated into that treaty because of these two stark categories. To bring the other currently 4 nuclear armed states into that treaty would mean some sort of endorsement or rubber stamping of their status as nuclear armed states, which would dilute the NPT's purpose, which is to restrict nuclear weapons to the group that currently had them at the time that treaty was signed. So I think, like, institutionally, that's quite difficult. So I think for those states, other instruments would be required, which is not, not to say that actually disarmament through the NPT wouldn't require other instruments, albeit maybe there might be subsidiary instruments. I think my reflection on this is for those states, they all have their own particular security situation that they're dealing with, and a discrete number of neighbours for whom they believe they need to keep nuclear weapons to protect themselves. Well, in North Korea, maybe not neighbours, maybe the US is maybe the one state, the main state that they wish to deter. So I think the steps for those states is to look at regional de-escalation strategies, to look at trying to form some sort of détente with those neighbours whom they wish to deter. And so that's how I think states in that position should start. I think the question for what instruments they would use to enter into disarmament and to enter into a disarmament agreement is probably some way down the line and not something that needs to be addressed now. I think the near-term need is for détente and de-escalation. Question of actors and the two big blocks. I think it's a very tricky question. I think one of the things that's quite complicated in IR is that obviously you have primary actors as states, and then once you get beyond it, things get very muddy very quickly. And this somewhat goes back to what Paul was saying about this question of who has the authority and gravitas to issue something like the Einstein-Russell Manifesto. I mean, he said Elon Musk, but it's kind of absurd to think of the sort of public figures. Would Jay-Z do that? With the Kardashians, I do wonder whether Einstein in particular had such a singular contribution to his field and upturned his field in such a way that he was an international celebrity in a way that scientists very rarely are. And that's not necessarily an artifact of that generation. It's an artifact of that one person and his particular stature. But I think it's a very difficult question. I don't really have the answer to who would do it. I think people who can should try, I think, is probably the answer that I would give you to that. On the bulletin, I think it's a tricky one, that, because it's maybe the one thing in this field that is guaranteed to get headlines when they change the seconds to midnight. To what extent it goes beyond getting headlines is a bit hard to say. I guess I think ordinary people who don't have a particular interest in this topic pick up on that, and politicians who don't know very much about this topic pick up on that and understand that we're in a desperate situation. But whether that translates to action, I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, thanks. Specifically on the India question, I think one of the things that you might look at, and this is actually coming out of a basic project on responsibility of nuclear weapon states. It's a really great project. Look it up when you get the chance. India and Pakistan have a particular history, which is quite known, and their nuclear weapons programs are oriented. Well, Pakistan's is oriented towards India's, and India's to some degree toward China. So exactly as Dave said, the responsible thing is to accept that they're not going to be part of the NPT under any nuclear weapons privileged status. But taking the responsibility, they can say, okay, we're going to talk to Pakistan, we're going to talk to China, and obviously it requires reciprocation, I understand that. What can we do to reduce the salience of nuclear weapons in our security policy? What can we do to reassure our neighbors that we're not going to, A, use them, but B, we're going to create the conditions under which the likelihood of escalation to nuclear weapons wanting to be used is completely minimized, right? And that's tricky. I mean, that's not an easy dialogue. I understand that completely. But that's where it should be headed, because I don't think in the way multilateralism is at the moment, there's going to be any new treaty, any movement within under UN auspices or India joining the TPNW as a nuclear weapons state, or, these aren't things that are realistic. So I think it is on those states to look to each other. And I think just a broader reflection then as well, and this is again something for you guys to research as you go into masters and PhD programs and so on. What are the drivers actually of nuclear proliferation? It comes back to the previous question, talking of South Korea and Japan and Poland even, but Iran is a really great example of where we are when you're talking about drivers of nuclear proliferation. Iran is in a region surrounded by a number of nuclear weapon states, right? It has the US as a kind of, not quite a mortal enemy, but a direct enemy. What is the US? It's quite a reckless and war-prone country, right? I mean, it invades countries at the drop of a hat. Sorry to say to the Americans, but I mean, it's factually borne out. So Iran feels threatened, right? It also has Israel in its neighborhood, which acts in its own security interests quite wantonly, if I can't think of a better word. It will strike, it struck against Syria, it struck against Iraq. It will behave as it wishes. So of course, Iran feels threatened. So we need to think about what regional security arrangements can, again, reduce incentives for nuclear proliferation. That's just a kind of broader one. On the non-state actors, and I subscribe exactly to what Dave said. We do what we can. Certainly within Pugwash, we try and do what we can. We try and hold dialogues between Russia, China, and the US to talk about what this kind of top-level nuclear disarmament could look like, or at least, again, reducing the salience of nuclear weapons. How can we create arms control? China, of course, feels it's not at parity with the other two, and therefore it doesn't have the same level of responsibility. How do you draw China into that kind of a conversation? And that's really a long, slow process. I mean, China's nuclear weapons program is at a slightly, I don't want to say behind the curve, but it's not at the same level institutionally as the US and Russia have it. So they don't actually have the individual diplomats, technicians who are experienced in having these discussions, and they're a little reluctant to get involved. But it's people who are encouraging them, right? And that is non-state actors. We have loads of groups, whether there are American delegations or European delegations, going to China and discussing, what arms control is, what it looks like, and how China could be involved. And I think that's just a really important contribution, but there's no short-term fix.
Yeah, sure. By the way, I particularly encourage any women to speak, so I will come back to you, but I'm just going to Richard first of all.
Yeah, I was going to ask some questions, but I just want to follow up on particularly on India and Iran. I mean, we're suffering at this point. Sorry, I'm Richard Guthrie. I'm from British Pugwash and chair of the trust that's paying for the conference. So if occasionally I say, look, absolute idiots, be careful what you say, is because I'm subject to charity law in doing things. So that's your opinion.
Not basics.
Yeah. But one of the things that is very easy to fall into a trap on at this point is black boxing countries. So India isn't just one simple box. It's full of individuals, full of institutional forces. Same for Iran. And one of the challenges in trying to understand policy development is trying to unpick what is happening in there. So, for example, in the case of India, you find that, say, defense ministry people are very focused on why they might want nuclear weapons because, this sounds a very simplistic statement, but it's really true, is people make decisions and make recommendations within the national policy processes for what they perceive to be in the country's interest. Now, it might be that when you have a different perspective, say from outside, you perceive it in a different way. But of course, you never get a change of policy unless you can persuade those people with influence in national structures that actually there is an alternative that's in their interest. Speak to foreign ministry people in India about nuclear weapons, and they often see it as an obstacle for them getting additional progress in some other areas. But you speak to people from the president's office, and they're really interested in the power and status issues, not necessarily how the nuclear weapons might assist in the defense of India, but what it says about India as a country. And so to say, oh, having this engagement with India might change something, actually the engagement has to be different to the Defence Ministry, to the Foreign Ministry, to the President's office. And really understanding all of that is really challenging. That's where entities like Pugwash can be very useful, is that if you look at the history of Pugwash, and I especially, I mean, I'm less of a nuclear person, more on the chemical and biological side, and my former boss, a chap called Julian Perry Robinson, did a very good article in the Proceedings of the New York Academy of Sciences about the Pugwash influence on chemical and biological disarmament. And one of the things that comes out of that work is you can find individuals, like you're saying about the difficulty within China, you find individuals, say, within what was the Soviet Union or others, who have an engagement and attraction nationally, and you can expose them to other ideas. I mean, a challenge of Iran, not to take the floor for too long, sorry, but is you have a tripartite governmental system, which has a sort of fairly conventional parliament, a lot of military influence, and the religious influence. And there are people who follow Iran much more carefully, but one of the most interesting statements one of them said was, never have all three agreed at the same time about what nuclear policy should be. And all have changed their positions and so on. But you speak to most analysts outside of Iran and they have no idea of what the internal debate is. So, yeah, I think I just want to check on the notes. I just wanted one quick comment about history, and that is actually less important than the immediate start of the Cold War is what happened in the 1930s. It's a really fascinating period. You've got the trauma of the First World War, huge efforts of people to say we don't want to repeat war. In the peace movement in Britain, a fascinating divergence where you had a very strong peace movement against military action in the Middle East, for example, because there was a lot of what you might call colonial activities. But a lot of the same people worried about what's happening with the rise of Hitler and should there be any form of rearmament. And if you look at the evidence available at the time, it's really difficult to know what, I've done it as a personal exercise, I've got some students to do it as an exercise. At what point would you have thought about, was it better for less military action? Was it better for a question of rearmament? There's no good answer, but to me, it's a really fascinating example of then how do you compare that with the situation we're in? Because if you honestly look at the information available in the 1930s, it's a classic case of trying to come to a conclusion with insufficient information. And at the moment, we have insufficient information. Thank you.
Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, longer than I intended. Right.
Hello, I'm Carolina. I'm getting a master's at UCL, and I wanted to ask, why do NPT countries feel almost entitled to have that position, that privilege? And that, as you mentioned, like they don't want to rubber stamp the other countries. Would you say that's kind of a legacy of colonialism and imperialism? Thank you.
Jonah, have I got time for one more?
Yeah.
I've got one. Yeah.
We finished at 11, right?
Yeah, finish. We've got. Okay,
We started a little late.
We're relaxed. It's very
Thank you. Hi, thanks for the discussion here today. I'm Ching Wei. I'm doing my master's at King's. Quick question. What would you say were the key variables which led to South Africa disarming and countries like Brazil turning away from nuclear weapons? And if there are any sort of lessons or parallels there for the countries now who are thinking about perhaps acquiring nuclear weapons? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Arthur Britton. I'm currently doing an undergraduate in law. My question is, with a history of war and an increase in talks about acquiring more nuclear weapons, do you think there's ever a world where we're completely nuclear disarmed? And if so, how long do you think that would take?
Yeah, you've got a few minutes, so you'll be fine to cover all these. No worries.
Small questions.
On the NPT, that's an interesting question. I think some of colonialism comes into it, and some of the status of being the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, as well as the 5 states within the NPT who are. We use the P5 as shorthand for within the NPT, but P5 is not terminology that belongs to that treaty. It's just the two groups are the same. So some of it is that status. I think some of it is the fact that they don't want to disarm, and so they are cynically interpreting that treaty as rubber stamping or endorsing or giving some sort of stature to their possessor status above and beyond what the treaty actually says, which is these states have them, they need to get rid of them. They have promised to get rid of them. So I think it's a mix of several things. Yeah. On South Africa disarming, South Africa is a really interesting case. My understanding of the rationale for it, it's particular to South Africa and the changes that were happening in South Africa at the time. So you had a racist white government who were seeing the writing on the wall and realizing that majority rule was coming, and they did not want the incoming government to have nuclear weapons, so they got rid of them. So it's quite a sui generis example. If you wanted to be provocative, you might want to think about whether any of the current nuclear possessor states might be analogous. But yeah, I think probably for most of the nuclear weapon states, engendering a situation where they feel more threatened by their own population than other states is not the most easy route to approach for disarmament. A world with complete disarmament, I think it's one of a number of possible futures. I think, I spoke about, I gave you half a Gramsci quote in my talk, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. I believe in that very strongly. I don't think any of us can see the future or know with any degree of certainty what outcomes are more or less likely. There are too many variables. So I think the important thing is to try and identify what the best outcomes are and work towards them. The timescale is difficult to speak about as well, because the details of how that might come about vary so much. In a situation where possessor states were interested in doing it and willing to do it and felt comfortable in doing it, you could achieve it in a decade or so. But that's the technical time that it takes to disarm a nuclear weapon state. It's not necessarily the diplomatic time.
I don't have anything to add beyond that, because I think that's an excellent note to end on for this panel, because and to give Dave his due as the main speaker for this panel. So thank you all for your excellent questions. Really good, interesting first session. And thanks to Dave for your talk. Thank you.